Hi, y'all. This video is kind of a supplement to the other ones that I planned to put together, but I figured that we needed to go into more depth on the cognitive cycle. So, this video goes into more depth on the cognitive cycle and how I developed it. It also talks specifically about how the cognitive cycle applies to learning. In this video, we'll talk about the meaning of learning, the purpose behind the cognitive cycle, the science behind the cognitive cycle, emotions and organismic sensing, applications of the cognitive cycle and the dimensions of learning. Let's talk for a moment about the word learning and why I've chosen to focus on it. There's certainly other words that could also apply, like growth, transformation, change, or actualization, but we don't generally use those words in our everyday life. Learning is the everyday word we use to cover all those things. When we say something like, I learned a lot from that experience, we mean that the experience changed or transformed us and made us grow and expand our horizons. It made us think and see things differently. Learning is what we're talking about in these videos. The problem is that we have a very low standard for what learning is and a very simplistic understanding of how we learn. When we think about learning, our minds go directly to memorizing facts, reading books, or taking classes. This low standard is probably because the word learning is frequently used in an educational or corporate training context, where we think of inflicting learning on people, such as teaching people what we feel they should know or modifying their behavior to what we think it should be. If this is learning, then no wonder we have such a low opinion of it. But we know there's way more to learning than this, and we need to be raising our standards for learning. It seems like Carl Rogers agreed. Carl Rogers was a renowned American psychologist and founder of humanistic psychology and person centered therapy. So, over my career, I felt called toward the idea of getting the most out of life individually, collectively, and I've gravitated toward learning as the solution that humanity needs. More recently, I've also focused on how we make healthy and sustainable differences that benefit everyone. As I've been working on this question, an unavoidable reality is that if we're looking to drive change, we need to do it right, because doing it wrong could make things worse. We see this all the time, especially since humanity is not very good at handling life's challenges. People set out to change something, possibly with good intentions, but a simplistic understanding and approach, and their solutions only cause more problems for other people down the line, or even for the very people they intended to help. We really, really need a healthier, more sophisticated approach. And I believe learning is that approach. And it's urgent that we get started. As we're getting started, let's throw out a couple of central premises: optimal health and all of humanity. First, let's consider the idea of optimal health. When we set out to make changes, either for ourselves or others, do we really know what we're hoping to achieve? What is that ultimate state we're working toward? We don't seem very clear about that, and then we seem to fight for things that actually reduce our health. If we were to think about how to fix a car, we would all agree on what we're working toward. The car works best when it's in line with its design and purpose. This is what healthy means, and any approach or change that makes something less healthy seems ridiculous. Shouldn't we be working toward determining what's healthy for us? There's also the idea of all of humanity. It seems like we should be moving toward an optimal state of health for each of us individually and all of us collectively. That would mean that every single human matters. Think about that for a moment. Can everyone really matter? Don't we have to make tough choices all the time about who matters more? Aren't there some people who just need to be eliminated or at least locked up or silenced? That may sound appalling, but think about all the movies, even kids' movies, that come to a satisfying end only when the villain is finally killed. And our majority rules political process is built around deciding which group gets to silence the opinions of the other group. What if we stood in the space where we all matter? What if we looked for solutions that optimized health for all of humanity? And what if we recognized that literally any other solution only made things worse? As we've discussed in earlier videos, understanding our cognitive cycle helps us get a better idea of what's healthy for each of us individually and all of us collectively. Then I got to thinking about how we facilitate change. For example, in coaching, there are approaches or interventions that we use to help facilitate change and growth for our clients. Obviously, this change happens within our clients' minds. So, if we better understood what's happening in their minds, wouldn't we be more effective in our approaches? Thinking more broadly, if we looked at every interaction we have with people, if we really knew what people were thinking, the effects we were having on them, wouldn't we do things differently? The cognitive cycle helps us predict our effects on people. In a way, it's kind of like reading their minds. But I would say it's more accurate to say it's understanding how complex our minds are and realizing that we never really know what's going on in people's minds. Can we actually read people's minds? I envisioned this experiment with reading dogs' minds, and I envisioned that I was 80% successful in predicting whether a dog wanted food or not. And I'm still working on getting this joke to land. If we're looking to optimize health for all of humanity, individually and collectively, there are a number of questions we need to address. What's going on in our minds, individually and collectively, in the moment and over time? What's the nature of our experience and our issues, and where does all exist? What's healthy? And how and where does change happen? Cognitive psychology, neurology, and epistemology start to offer answers. We and our experience are really complex, and there's a lot of stuff in our head. The fields of psychology and counseling psychology also think about these questions. We're shaped by the stuff in our head, and that stuff is not as accurate as we think it is. Here are a couple of other models that also show how our thought processes shape how we feel and react. So it seems like our experience works like this. We have some stuff in our head, such as beliefs, self-concepts, norms, values, and biases. We'll call that stuff mindsets. Those mindsets come from experiences within our environment, which is heavily influenced by other people. Sometimes this environment is supportive of healthy growth, but it's frequently less than optimal. We get confronted by some situation in our life, and our mind goes to work on it, perceiving, observing, filtering, interpreting, telling a story, judging, evaluating, predicting, reasoning, and solving. This happens so quickly that we're typically not aware that it's even occurring. We just find ourselves with some conclusion about the situation we're considering. We just find ourselves with some conclusion about the situation without considering how we got there. This is where we have the opportunity. No, this is where things have the opportunity to make us healthier or less healthy. Our mind starts to process what's happening to us based on the mindsets in our head. How effectively that processing is depends on how effective our thought processes are and how accurate our mindsets are. Since being human is hard and we're not very good at handling it, you can imagine that our thought processes and mindsets are less than optimal. Our processing brings us almost instantly to a conclusion that we're convinced is true, whether it actually is or not. We then start to feel a certain way about the situation based on that conclusion. Then we respond in numerous ways that we might not even be aware of, which causes some result and has some effect on the situation confronting us. We process that situation in our less than optimal way and create new mindsets that are not as accurate as we think they are, and use those less than optimal mindsets to process future situations. Makes you wonder how we even survive. Carl Rogers, the counseling psychologist we mentioned earlier, did a lot of work to determine how to help people get healthier. One conclusion that he came to was that humans had a basically positive direction, a self-righting reflex that leads us naturally to a healthier state. He proposed that humans have organismic sensing, some inner, non-intellectual sensing that we can trust to discover the most effective approach to each situation. The problem is that our organismic sensing tends to get distorted by ineffective thought processes and inaccurate mindsets. So, what we experience is usually only what we feel is acceptable to experience. As we learn to accept ourselves, we become more aware of and learn to trust our natural perception. Think about it like this. What if part of us already knows who we are? What if we already had a natural sense of ourself and our environment, a natural sense of who we are and our purpose, a natural sense of what's important to us, and a natural connection with others? This is what Carl Rogers referred to as organismic sensing. We experience this natural sense as feelings or emotions. Note that this organismic sensing only works to the extent that our senses are effective and accurate. Any distortion, negative or positive, hurts the system, and any untruth reduces the overall health of the system. You've probably experienced these distortions like this. You ask yourself, how do I feel, or what do I believe, want, or value? Then immediately, probably without even realizing you're doing it, you ask yourself, are these feelings and beliefs acceptable? If you get a no, then you immediately, probably without even realizing you're doing it, tell yourself, I don't really feel that way. And then we put a mask over our real feelings so that we can conform more to what's considered acceptable. This happens even more strongly when other people tell you that your feelings or beliefs are unacceptable, and you start to reinforce the mindset that my feelings don't matter. A good facilitator, coach, or counselor actually works to help turn this cycle around by building rapport in a safe environment. When you ask yourself, are these feelings and beliefs acceptable? The facilitator can project that your feelings do matter. This may help you consider that maybe your feelings actually do matter, and try responding in a way more aligned with your actual, natural, organismic sensing. When you realize that the facilitator didn't judge you, you may reduce the mask that covers up your emotions and reconsider how much others' evaluations matter to you. Now, when you go through the cognitive cycle, you're more aligned with your organismic sensing and your self-righting reflex, which means you develop more effective thought processes and more accurate mindsets. And you no longer need the mask to cover up your emotions. It's worth taking a moment to consider what we mean when we're talking about feelings. Do we really know? We treat feelings as if they just get in our way. They can be inconvenient and even icky. Think about how much of our mindsets, narratives, institutions, etc., are built to help us dismiss and avoid our feelings. To be sure, we've covered up our feelings so much with mindsets, narratives, institutions, etc., that we've lost our sense of what our feelings actually are. We tell ourselves and each other what we're meant to feel, value, and believe. We're told to control our feelings so that we can work towards something considered more important or valuable or appropriate. But if you think about it, anything that's ever been important to any of humanity has been important only because we felt it was important. Nothing has intrinsic value. In fact, the very concept of value itself is because we feel it's valuable. We may place value on something, but that value is only because we perceive that we need that something to get something else that we feel is valuable to us. We know so little about emotions that we tend to dismiss them as unimportant. We treat our feelings as if they were different from our thoughts, which we consider to be much more reasonable guide to how we approach our life. But are what we experience as thoughts and feelings really so different just because we don't understand them? What if what we experience as feelings is actually a sense of something much deeper? This is the equivalent to the organismic sensing that Carl Rogers spoke about. A sense of who we are. Our feelings show us what we want and need, what's valuable to us, what we're passionate about. It's where we find our natural feelings of enthusiasm for life and empathy for others. We sometimes experience our feelings as a spiritual connection. To be healthier, we need to be more connected to our emotions. In fact, our connection to our emotions is really the only sense we have about what healthy actually is. More collective fields, such as sociology, social psychology, economics, study how we work collectively and how that affects us individually. We are influenced by our environment, and we live up to external beliefs, expectations, and judgment. And it becomes clear that it's not enough just to change ourselves, we need to change the world around us. Think about addicts who go into rehab and get cleaned up, only to relapse when they return to their environment. We need not only to address how we handle things individually, but also collectively. Which leads us to this model, which we've covered in early videos. It's worth mentioning that the levels and components in this model are not always distinct, they tend to blend together. For example, we use thought processes to create mindsets, and our thought processes then refer frequently to those mindsets as we process. Our culture and narratives can be embedded in institutions, and can reinforce social dynamics, which in turn enforce the culture and narratives. It isn't so important that we correctly classify our experience into these different levels and components, but that we recognize that this cognitive cycle is happening and how the components interact with each other. We should also note that we're not usually aware of what's happening on these levels. We might think we're conscious of what's going on in our minds, but in reality, so much more is going on subconsciously that we're not aware of. Think, for example, about how quickly we react or jump to conclusions without giving any thought to why we reacted that way or arrived at that conclusion. Collectively, though we pretend that everything is explicit and out in the open, we know that most of what happens in our interactions and relationships goes on tacitly. Think about those unspoken rules we feel compelled to follow even though no one speaks about them. This cognitive cycle is even more complicated when we consider more than one person. All of these less than optimal processes leads us to less than optimal results that then become the less than optimal experience for the other person to process, and their less than optimal processing then becomes our less than optimal experience, and this goes on and on. So hopefully this demonstrates why communication is so difficult, and it also demonstrates why our collective processing is less than optimal. To describe this cognitive cycle, let's start by hypothetically considering how the cycle is supposed to work, that is, in a healthy person. We experience and process life, which includes referencing our previous experiences and beliefs and connecting with how we feel about it. We also, possibly without knowing it, create a working hypothesis for what's going on, what the right approach should be, and what the future result will be. Then, we respond based on that working hypothesis, and life produces a result. Since our response is not likely to be perfect, the result probably isn't perfect, but it does give us data. We process the data about the result, including how we feel about it, and adjust our beliefs, then we respond again. And every time we go around the cycle, which happens countless times instantaneously, we're updating our beliefs about how life works. The healthier our thought processes in connection with our feelings, the more accurate those beliefs become. This is especially true if we have the support of a healthy environment. If we all have healthy processes as we go through this cycle collectively, we also have healthy collective responses, which creates an even healthier environment for us to grow within. Now let's see what happens when we enter a distortion into the cycle, such as some distorted belief system introduced by others within our environment. As we navigate the social dynamics, culture, and narratives with the other people in our environment, we internalize these distorted beliefs as our own mindsets. Depending on how overbearing the social dynamics are, those distorted beliefs are likely to include the idea that your beliefs and feelings don't matter. So, as we process new experiences, we spiral through all these distorted beliefs. We get caught within the spiral, which goes so fast we don't realize it's happening, and we come to distorted conclusions, a distorted hypothesis, which we're convinced in that moment is absolutely true. And based on this distorted sense of reality we created, our emotions are also distorted. This is where things get much worse. We experience what's called an amygdala hijack, where our brain shuts down our executive processing in preparation for fight or flight mode. Our response is far less effective than we need it to be, which leads us to disappointing results. And as we keep spiraling, not only do our conclusions and emotions get even more distorted, but we form even less accurate mindsets that will reduce our effectiveness processing future situations. We call these distorted mindsets issues, which become part of our collective, and they continue the distorted cycle. Our thoughts can spiral out of control so quickly we're not even aware that these thought processes occurred. The key to stopping distorted spirals is recognizing that they're happening and analyzing them. If we find ourselves in a spiral, or if we realize later that we had been in one, try to slow down your thought process and notice what's going on. Consider the accuracy of the conclusion you're coming to and of the thought processes and mindsets that led you there. Does your thought process make sense? Are the mindsets you drew from accurate? Is the conclusion or hypothesis you came to really realistic? Are there other potential hypotheses that might also be plausible? You might also identify something that triggers these spirals for you. Note that what you're doing here is analyzing how realistic your thought processes are and not trying to replace those thought processes with other beliefs or feelings or behaviors that are deemed more appropriate. Remember, it was distorted beliefs that caused the spiral in the first place. Even positive distortions can distort your natural senses. As we analyze our spiral, chances are that your analysis will reduce your distorted mindsets and lead you to more realistic hypothesis. And if you can learn to recognize the trigger, you may be able to stop the spiral before it happens. We can also reconnect with our natural feelings. It's also vital, as you look back on this spiral situation, to look at what actually happened when the situation played itself out. How does what actually happened compare to the hypothesis or conclusion you were sure was true when you were in the spiral? Analyzing what actually happened helps you to be more effective and accurate the next time a similar situation occurs. As we go through the cognitive cycle countless times every second, we're continually updating our mindsets, storing and encoding our learnings, and we then count on those mindsets to help us with our future thought processes. We are, in a sense, products of our past experience and learning. What we encoded is with us and shapes our moments in the present and future. As we all interact with each other, our mindsets become embedded and shared within our culture and narratives. And as the culture and narratives are reinforced by our social dynamics, they become a part of our environment and may even become formalized in institutions. And we continue to go through this cycle individually and collectively throughout our lives let me try this again because this is important. And we continue to go through the cycle individually and collectively throughout our lives and through the generations that come before and after us. Given how interconnected this cycle is, it's easy to see how issues can quickly compound like interest on a debt, not just among our current society, but across the generations before and after us. Since our processing is suboptimal, our mindsets are suboptimal, which makes our current processing suboptimal, which sets us up for suboptimal future processing. We have ineffective thought processes and inaccurate mindsets that cloud our perception. Our environment and the others within it influence our perception and drives us to question our natural senses. We experience feelings based on perceptions, interpretations, and beliefs that are not accurate, and we lose sight of what our real feelings are. As we look at the cognitive cycle, we're left with some key takeaways about dealing with our issues. We should be analyzing, not distorting, truths. We should be connecting with, not controlling, feelings. And we should be co-creating, not inflicting change. We've talked about the dimensions of learning in earlier videos. Let's spend a moment looking at how those dimensions might interact with the cognitive cycle. This isn't a comprehensive analysis, but hopefully the cognitive cycle can help us see how sophisticated our learning needs to be. The first dimension, building capabilities to get results reliably, is about getting results. Traditionally, when we talk about building capabilities, we're normally talking about knowledge and skills, so we may find ourselves focusing on the mindsets and thought processes. But the cognitive cycle shows us that there's so much more involved in getting these results. But the cognitive cycle shows us that there's so much more involved in getting the results we want, including our capabilities in navigating the cognitive cycle itself. For example, consider the social skills involved in navigating our collective experience in order to influence our environment and to influence our collective results. The second dimension, creating more effective solutions, may seem to focus on thought processes. But remember that learning teaches us to think more holistically. For example, creating effective solutions also involves letting go of mindsets for the ways things have always been done. Inspiration and creativity come from connection to our emotions and may involve challenging social conventions. And obviously, we need to be paying attention to and evaluating our results to determine how effective our solutions actually are. The third dimension, embracing opportunity with curiosity and adventure, deals with feelings because opportunities can be challenging and daunting. We really need to connect with our natural interests and motivations and with our organismic sensing that helps us stay aware of ourselves and our environment. We also probably need to confront some mindsets and thought processes about how life works, especially if we're prone to panicking when confronted with new situations. And we also need to pay attention to and learn from the results we're getting and how they affect us. The fourth dimension, becoming a healthier, stronger, better person, is where we deal with all of the issues we've discussed before. As we work through those issues and get better at navigating the cognitive cycle in a healthy way, we have less need for rules or for controlling ourselves and emotions because we're more naturally graceful and effective. For example, we don't get emotionally hijacked as easily. The fifth dimension, discovering and optimizing our potential, starts with a connection with our feelings. Because, as we've been discussing, your feelings are your true sense of who you are. You'll also need to confront an array of self-concepts, limiting beliefs, norms, values, and biases within your own mindsets and embedded in our collective identities, cultures, dynamics, and institutions. Also, as we've discussed, becoming yourself involves not just discovering who you are, but discovering who you are around others, which means that this dimension will pull together all of the components. The sixth dimension, seeking and recognizing truth and wisdom, seems to focus on our beliefs and self-concepts, norms, values, and biases, and how consistent they are with our actual experience of life. Remember, though, that we believe what we believe because of all the components in this cognitive cycle. It wouldn't be fair or realistic just to replace our beliefs with beliefs that are considered to be more acceptable. For example, we really need to pay attention to the emotional level. We hold on to beliefs as crutches because we depend on them. Many times we cannot face a reality where these beliefs are not true. This really is a dimension that depends on a holistic approach to all of these components. And of course, the seventh dimension, getting the most out of life, really is where all the components are working at their healthiest. Of course, we still have a lot to learn about learning to learn. Here are a few items, more to come on that later. And all of this because we're learning to learn.